Okay, yeah, like I said, thanks for coming out. It's been like 3 years since we put out an issue of Marbles because of what happened in the world, and I don't have any money, so it was hard to get the funds together. So this is why it's been a 3-year wait. But I do appreciate you guys, and this magazine I think is one of the best. We managed to get some incredible people in it. Most of whom are actually here, like you and you and you and you and you, not you, sorry. You're here because we want to hear your really valid and awesome opinions about things. Yeah. Yes, a strong supporter. Yeah. Basically, yeah, like, so the theme of the magazine is what now, which I think that most people were kind of had in their heads coming out of the pandemic, just like what's going on. And a lot of people's personal circumstances changed throughout the pandemic. And yeah, and professional circumstances changed throughout the pandemic, and there's quite a lot about that in the book as well, in the magazine as well. But instead of like kind of focusing on kind of negative stuff, I wanted the launch to be a little bit more, I don't know, slightly more positive. So I just asked my two really good pals to talk about some of our favourite things, which is horror and SFF, which stands for
sci-fi and fantasy.
Right, yeah. So we've got Kat here who writes SFF very well, and
H and horror.
And H horror. And then Bex is the founder of Haunt Publishing, which is an incredible publisher based in Edinburgh. I think you pretty much do it yourself, except I did help slightly last time. And we're just going to chat about like horror and fantasy and mental health and just the ways in which like imagination and can kind of help us escape, I guess, if there's a word for it, I suppose, from the, like reality, I suppose, and how horror and fantasy depict mental health and illness in good or bad ways. So that is all to say. Could you please sort that out? Thanks. I'm just going to start asking questions now. Okay, right. Well, yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about who you are, why you're talking tonight, and how your relationship with horror in particular began?
All right. I'm going to have to Liam Gallagher it, I think. Yes, that makes sense. Tell me how close is too close.
No, it's good now.
Hello. I am not going to spill your drink.
Thanks.
Or destroy your cake. So, hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Wojturska. As Kirsten mentioned, I'm the founder of Haunt Publishing, and we publish Gothic, horror, and generally just kind of dark fiction, so novels, short story collections, that kind of thing. I have loved horror since I was a fetus. So, so yeah, I think for me it just started with going to the library all the time as a child, discovering Goosebumps, and I feel like that is everyone's gateway into horror. So yeah, like Goosebumps, point horror, all that kind of thing. And then it kind of grew from there. I studied Gothic literature at university, and yeah, things got out of hand, and here I am. So I write a lot of horror. I have not had anything published because I'm too scared to share it. But I do write as well about mental health, mental illness, and I have been published with Marbles. This is my second Marbles rodeo. So so yeah, that's my kind of writing in a nutshell.
And what about you? Same question.
What was the question? Who am I? Why am I here?
Who am I? That's deep.
Can everybody hear me with this mic? Yes? Perfect. Yeah, so I'm Kathleen Watt, so I write SFFH, which is speculative fiction, all under that umbrella. So I used to write a lot more science fiction. I feel like I'm like in Glastonbury or something. Can everyone hear that? Yeah? Okay. No, you're good. I used to write a lot more science fiction, and then I kind of moved away from it for a bit because I found I didn't find the space that exciting, but I feel like now science fiction, there is so much fascinating stuff going on there because of the types of voices that are being platformed. And I kind of moved into the fantasy space and then moved into the horror space, and now I do all of them because why not? Why limit yourself? So so I have kind of a short story collection which is fantasy and horror, and I'm working on a high fantasy novel at the moment, but my short fiction kind of runs the whole gamut of all of those things. And I feel like the mental health and imagination aspect are so entwined that it makes so much sense to me that we're having this conversation, and I feel like the discourse around it has become a lot more open and nuanced over the past few years, and I for one welcome it.
Oh, good. I also just want to mention that if you want to read one of Kat's really good stories, you're published in the second issue of Extra Teeth magazine, which you can probably get, I don't know, if you go on extrateeth.co.uk, maybe there, I don't know. But yeah, that was one which made me kind of look up, sit up and go, oh, you can write. Okay, yeah, you weren't lying when you said that you could write. Yeah, okay, you actually can.
It's very weird. It's scary and sexy, which apparently is my brand. So just a fair warning.
And that is basically how I would sum you up: scary and sexy. Yeah, spooky and sexy. Yeah. Except it's actually a scary story. It's scary. Yeah. I've lost the questions. Okay, so yeah, mental illness and how it's depicted in horror isn't always done amazingly. So I just kind of wanted to talk about how you've seen it sort of portrayed over the years and the ways in which it can kind of impact people who live with, lived experience of mental ill health. As people who might fall under that umbrella, how do you kind of balance that? Like your love for it and how you are as a person. Who wants to go first?
You. I'll go first. Yeah, so as you said, the portrayal of mental illness hasn't been great in horror. And to be honest, it still isn't great. There's a lot of work still to be done. Thinking of film, I think it was like, is it The Cabinet of like Dr. Caligari or something from the 20s? Like, I think that kind of was one of the first, if not the first kind of horror film to portray mental illness negatively and use that trope of the twist of, the main person or a core character, they're mentally ill. And that's meant to be the twist. That's meant to make you like shocked and then fearful of that person. And it's a horrible trope, and it has lasted, and you still get films doing it now, like even Shutter Island and, things like that. So, it's had a bad beginning, and it continues to be bad. But, I'm just trying to think of, basically, I think the issue is when the main discourse around mental illness, especially like when portrayed in horror, comes from these films and not from the communities of people actually living with the mental illnesses, then that's what people associate with that mental illness. So they're not listening to the communities, they've watched a film and now they're scared of someone if they've had that mental illness, and it can affect how you interact with that person. I would even argue it affects things like employment and like friendships, and it just has a massive knock-on effect. And people might scoff and think, it's horror films, what you're talking about. But as I say, it depends who's got the loudest voice, the widest reach, and if that is entertainment, then I think there should be a responsibility to portray these things properly. Like, we want to learn about the mental illness, even if it is through a horror film, because, I mean, like in Psycho, for example, Norman Bates has dissociative identity disorder, but what did we learn about that from Psycho? We learned nothing other than, oh, that's a scary thing, and he's a scary person. It must be because he has this mental illness. So I think those are the core issues with the portrayal. I realised that was very film heavy, but I'm sticking with it. So
yeah. I just want to kind of, I guess, build on what Becky was saying. I kind of feel like so much of the history of media when it comes to mental health in the speculative genre places it as the monstrous, as the other, and as also dangerous and violent. And it's kind of what you were saying. It's like, what is that? It's that message that's being continually kind of reinforced. And that's so harmful for us as a society, but also people as individuals who are kind of going through their own mental health journey and maybe are reluctant to do that research and explore that because they're afraid of what they are, because society has told them that is wrong and that is evil. And I think obviously that's so dangerous, and it's really isolating to kind of posit it as this binary of good and bad. And if I can bring kind of fantasy into it as well, I feel like we all love a villain origin story, and we all love that kind of you love to hate them kind of character. But I think fantasy can also be quite guilty of flattening this idea of what motivates people to do certain things, and without exploring the nuances of what that means, it can just kind of be like, well, we're going to have a villain origin story and then they just went mad and that's it. And it's there's no kind of thoughtfulness going behind that.
I feel like fantasy gets away with it almost a little bit more because like I think we're focused on horror. We know that it's a problem in horror. Not so much in fantasy.
Yeah, I feel like I haven't seen as much discourse around it as I have in the horror genre, and I feel like that moment is coming, and I think it's starting to happen. But I look forward to seeing more of it in the same way that I think horror has kind of embraced the problems of the genre and is starting to kind of unpack that now.
Oh, wow, that was right there. Sorry, I can't read this. So I guess in terms of how to portray people who live with mental ill health in horror films, I guess there's also the kind of thing, do we even need to do that? Like, is there a space or a way that we can talk about mental illness in horror or in SFF in a healthy way? Do you think that that's possible to do? And if so, how do you think, or are there any good examples of how people have gone about doing that?
I personally think so, because I think horror and even Gothic is the perfect format to explore these things, because especially Gothic literature and film, it's not binary, it's about the liminal, it's about the in-between. So, and that's the kind of discourse we need around mental illness. We can't do good versus evil, as Kat said. It does need to explore those grey areas, the liminal spaces. You know, it's different for everyone. So it's the perfect format to do it. They just haven't been doing it very much. So I think there is really good scope for it. And I'm trying to think, you know, obviously the Babadook is a, you know, obvious example, deals with kind of depression and grief really well. And it is never, the monster is external and something that it's scary to live with mental illness. You know, I myself can say that. So, but the fear isn't a threat to other people. It's scary for yourself, and processing that and learning how to cope with it. That's where the fear comes from. So things like the Babadook, even Hereditary, does that really well. Again, exploring grief, and I like Hereditary because I think it shows how grief affects people differently. Like everyone in that family, you know, experiences it in different ways. Not to say any of the references I make when I'm talking about things done well, I'm not saying they're perfect. There's always going to be, you know, they're not perfect. Sorry, but those are the two films that came to mind that at least do a bit more of a nuanced job.
Yeah, I would also put Midsommar in that category as well.
We all went to see that together, did we not?
We did.
Always sit next to Kirsten during a horror film. The best reactions, like screaming, like I love it.
I've never, my fight or flight kicked in for maybe the first time in my life, and I remember I didn't have any control of myself. I remember I was sitting next to you actually, and maybe you, and I like stood up and was like halfway out of my seat before I realised what was going on. The bit where the cliff bit, if you've seen, yeah. No.
I've never heard you swear so much in my life.
I think also, I guess for some fantasy and sci-fi examples, I would definitely add Black Mirror into kind of the list of, I wouldn't necessarily say they always get it right, but they always have a very like nuanced approach. And I think that like kind of the way that they use technology often as kind of a metaphor or as like a funnel for kind of human emotions made extreme, is always really interesting. In terms of fantasy, I feel like I'm always referencing Studio Ghibli, but I feel like they always do such a good job, especially when it comes to grief, and exploring the kind of the very individual ways that people react to that, the way that you can find beauty in sadness, and that it can be kind of a whole kind of spectrum of different feelings, and it's not a static way of being and moving through the world. So I think that, and also because so many of the protagonists in those films are children, I think it kind of adds a new lens to look through those things. And I think it is really important that we are having those conversations about introspection and kind of figuring out who you are as you're moving through the world from that young age. So I would kind of throw that into my mix of nuanced perspectives in media.
Ask you. Well, it was interesting because I've been going through quite a comedy horror phase at the moment, and it's such a when you look at it, these shows that came out like 20 years ago, or whatever, and you look at it with like a today's eye, and you just think, oh wow, this is the most offensive thing I've seen and you will always be more offended by the thing that affects you, obviously. But there's some that unfortunately it's just like, the punchline is that there's a bunch of mental patients escaped from the hospital, and you're just like, oh, look, why do you think, and this isn't a question that I briefed you on, so sorry, I'm going to get you on your toes now, but why do you think that it's such, oh wait, it's right here. Why do you think it's such an easy go-to stereotype?
As in the stereotype of kind of
horror being the punchline,
right?
Being the punchline.
Yeah, I think it reflects kind of the societal opinion of what that used to be. I kind of we're getting really like intertextual here, but I'm going to talk about a video game which I really enjoy that I think deals with mental health in quite an interesting way. So it's this game called Alice Madness Returns by American McGee, which came out in like 2011, and it's a kind of reinterpretation of Alice in Wonderland, and it kind of goes between the world of Wonderland and the world of kind of Victorian era London, where the protagonist is kind of walking around, and she's going through hypnotherapy with her therapist, and he is aiming to have her forget all of the trauma that she experienced. So she lost her family in a fire, and since then has been kind of in a lot of unstable living situations. And as a kind of a woman in Victorian era, without family, without money, without that stability, that was a very dangerous position for her to be in. But the kind of the level design, the art design really reflects kind of what's going on in her mind, because Wonderland is in her mind. And it kind of sort of makes grotesque people that she meets, and things like that. But there's a really good storyline around authority figures in mental health, and I don't want to say more because it's a spoiler, but it really delves into this idea of, if you are, especially kind of that gendered aspect and that kind of class and societal element. So I think it's really easy to make that other, because I think it's what we all fear. I think that for a lot of people, this idea of being trapped, not being believed, losing that sense of agency, losing that sense of control and that sense of reality, and knowing what's real and what's not, is so deeply scary to us, because I think we're always asking, like, what makes us human, what makes us who we are, and there's so much about that that's intangible and that is kind of in your mind, and if you lose control of that, you lose a sense of yourself. So I think we can all relate to that as kind of a deep-seated fear. So I think that's why we kind of see it as abject. We kind of are revulsed by it because we fear it so innately. Just to get really deep and psychological on you.
Well, it's good. I mean, you have to. Yeah.
That was way more comprehensive. I was just going to be like, because it's easy. Yeah, it's like exactly. So it's just, if society's being conditioned to already fear these things, then horror plays on it because they think it's an existing fear that they can kind of utilize and, get those scares in. So it's lazy.
So what are some, to kind of make it a bit more positive now, what in fantasy or horror are some good examples of portrayals of people who live with mental ill health?
I think there are a couple, and again, I'm not saying like these examples are perfect, but I like books where they've taken a trope and they're kind of working with it and, turning it on its head. So I think Beloved by Toni Morrison's a good one. Obviously, that's more Gothic than horror, but it looks at kind of trauma and generational trauma. And I think it plays with the kind of horror trope of othering, but the scary thing is white supremacy, and you see how that creates trauma and the impact that has on the protagonist. So I like when books play with that. So Beloved is a really good example, I think. I did like, again, this one isn't perfect, and I think we've had discussions on this one, but Last House on Needless Street, yeah, not perfect, but yeah. I would, and no spoilers, but I think it at least attempts to handle something more sensitively. And it builds up the tropes where I started getting mad at it because I thought it was just doing the tropes, and then it turned it on its head.
I would actually shout out all of Katrina Ward's books, because I think they all deal with that in different ways.
Yes.
In quite nuanced ways.
And Sundial as well.
Sundial,
yeah.
And also Little Eve.
Oh, I've not read that.
Potentially.
Okay.
It depends how you interpret it, but I feel like even if not directly, indirectly it's dealing with that too. So she's definitely an author to check out if you're interested in that.
Those were my two examples off the top of my head, but I don't know if you have any more. I'm not asking the questions here.
Sorry. I think from fantasy, I would probably add the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang. I feel like they're like kind of epic fantasy trilogies. They are like doorstopper books, but they are fantastic. And it kind of it's like the ultimate villain origin story, and that's not a spoiler. You kind of know that from the beginning. But I think what is so powerful about it is that you get the space as a reader to follow that journey, and you completely like are along with them. You understand, you inhabit their mind, you inhabit all of the things that they're going through, and it's a lot of it is about PTSD. It's all about war. It's about becoming a weapon yourself. There is obviously kind of fantasy elements in terms of like sort of magical power, but I think the way that the author kind of explores what power does, I think that's kind of for me what I'm really interested in fantasy, because often magic is kind of can be kind of like a metaphor for a certain type of power, and that can corrupt, and that can change and damage, and it can have like a real cost for a person to be able to use that, and to kind of, it's a skill that you kind of have to learn and you have to keep using. And so in the Poppy War, there's definitely like detrimental side effects to kind of being that powerful and kind of having that communion with like a non-human entity. So I think that as a trope comes up quite a lot in fantasy books, but I feel like that trilogy does a really good job of kind of taking you all the way through a person's kind of journey from one place to another place, and you're like, they're the same person and I understand how they got there, but oh no, now I'm like on the side of the bad person. But I think that's like a real skill as an author, to be able to make the reader empathize and understand. Yeah.
Can I get a quick time check from you, please? Okay, oh, plenty of time. Okay, cool. Okay, so when I was kind of researching what on earth to ask you guys for this, I came across this quote from Wes Craven, which I thought was really interesting. Horror films don't create fear, they release it. And sorry, I'm being very horror heavy. I'm really glad that you're bringing fantasy in it. But yeah, in terms of that, how do you think, does that relate to you? I mean, as a consumer of horror films, because I know that's how I got into horror, basically, was that I was a really spooky little kid, and then I totally, as a teenager, I was just absolutely not, and I just hated it, and I was scared of everything. And then when I was doing my, my dissertation, I think, at uni, I just started watching horror films because they were the only thing that was worse than what was going on in my life at the time. And I really feel that. So this is why this quote really resonates with me. It was just like, oh, okay, I can put my fear and all my, I mean, you were laughing, and it was funny, but like I also had a breakdown. But yeah, so I was putting my sort of fear about what was happening in the world into, like, it kind of validated me, and it was kind of like, okay, fine, yeah, you can feel frightened because of this. So yeah, long story short, how does that relate to you?
So when I was in first year of uni, I would like come home from a night out and then put on a horror film to like go to sleep to. Often ones I hadn't seen, like I'd seen like Rosemary's Baby like 3 times before I actually saw the whole film, because that was the way I decided to watch it, obviously. But I think I've kind of said to my partner often that I find horror very soothing because there's a format, like that thing in Scream is like, there's a very simple formula, like there's a formula, and that's really comforting in some ways, because you kind of, and obviously some of those kind of tropes are really harmful, about kind of the person of color dying first, the slut dying because how dare you have sexual urges as a woman. So there are some like not great tropes in the horror genre when it comes to that, but I think there is something about those patterns that we find really comforting. Our brain kind of lights up and it's like, oh yes, I know where this is going. And there's something really, I think especially when you're watching like, like a good bad film, you're like, this is not like 47 meters down Uncaged. Like, exactly what you're into. It's a shark movie. And for me, it's like the horror is not the sharks. I'm like, fine. The horror is scuba diving and running out of air and dying underwater all alone. So you get different things out of it, I think, depending what particular trauma you're bringing to the table. But I think that it is, I think it's that thing of, if you see it happen to someone else, it won't happen to you. And as a consumer of a lot of true crime, I feel like it's the same buttons that I'm pushing in my brain, where it's like, the world is scary. If I look it in the eye, it can't happen to me, because I know I have sort of armored myself with I've sat in the bath of horror, and therefore I am protected, which is completely counterintuitive, but I think for me that's often how I look at it.
Yeah, you see, it's counterintuitive, but actually, I remember when when we all kind of shut down and COVID first started happening, people who live with really really bad anxiety were just apparently were less affected by it than people who don't, because they were like, we've been preparing for this shit our entire lives, right? So people who'd never experienced any sort of anxiety were just like, oh my god, I'm panicking, and people who kind of had anxiety were a bit like, oh yeah, well this was obviously going to happen, so I know what I'm doing and I was ready for this. So I think that's kind of another way about it as well. What do you think of the original question, which was?
What was the quote again?
Oh, the quote was, horror films don't create fear, they release it. Yeah.
Yes, I do like that.
Yeah.
And again, I think Kat was right. It depends what you're bringing to the table when you initially watch it. But I would say there have films that have given me new fears that I never thought I had. I was not scared of caves until The Descent. And now I'm terrified. And I think both me and you got obsessed with looking up horror true stories
I'm slightly obsessed with caves and cave diving. So much so that I've put it into my book because I simply need someone else to share in this fear.
Yeah, it's it's scary. And also, I wasn't too scared I've always been scared of whales, particularly blue whales, and I don't know why.
Orcas will mess you up.
They are.
Can we swear?
But I respect them. But blue whales terrify me. But I wasn't scared of the deep sea too much, or at least getting lost in it until I watched Open Water. That's done really well in terms of what would actually happen if you did get stranded out at sea and you were left. It's none of this shark, although I love 47. Watch it.
As a bum, I always really like watching those experts break down. I was watching one which was an expert breaks down shark attack movies, and sharks deeply misunderstood, but they didn't break down how terrifying the ocean is just in general. So I was like, this is what I was really hoping from the catharsis, but we're just weird people, I think.
Yeah, but now I'm scared of everything because of horror.
Well, I mean, speaking of whales, it just reminded me of that well-known horror film Pinocchio, the Disney version, which is terrifying, by the way, because when they turn into donkeys, it's horrifying. I watched it again recently, but when I was young, I remember watching when I was younger, and the image of the whale, what's it called again? I can't remember what it's called. It's got a name, I think. And you can see it coming out of the water, and it's just a big kind of hump like that. And where I grew up is a place called Girvan, and from my house out the window you could see Ailsa Craig, which is a big suspiciously whale-shaped hump like that. So in my young mind I just thought, oh, that's the whale from Pinocchio, and then I just assumed that I'd get eaten by the whale every time I went into the sea. So yeah, I feel you on whales.
I'm not coming to your house.
It's a volcanic rock, which is even scarier. And as writers, how, if at all, do you funnel sort of your what you're laughing?
A lot is the answer.
Please tell me how you funnel your sort of your illness, your mental illness, let's just say it, into your stories.
Sure. I'll probably have less to say because you write more than I do. Well, obviously I write a lot of nonfiction about mental illness anyway. I obviously stay, to things that I have experience of, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, body dysmorphic disorder, and always with the, I'm not the expert on it. I can only speak to my experience, which I think is why I love Marbles, because that's exactly what you publish, and you can get all the experiences in the world. And with horror, I have written horror stories again that use eating disorders maybe as metaphors. So again, because that's what has been the scariest parts of my life, going through these things, being able to write about that and scare other people with it, but in a tasteful way, that's kind of how I channel it.
I think I use body horror a lot. You mentioned the story in Extra Teeth. That's just it's about anglerfish but scary and sexy. So all my marine fears come out. I have a lot of marine fears, but also I feel like you don't realize what particular neuroses you're working through until you start writing stuff and people start reading it and being like, you're really interested in childbirth and pregnancy. I'm like, am I? I'm like, oh yes, I am. And often in very body horror kind of ways. And I think perhaps you know, obviously Alien is like a banging film when it comes to that. I'm just like, I feel like that's such an obvious image. And also it's one of the great films that crosses the sci-fi and the horror genres. And I had a great experience watching that movie with my flatmate in Canada, who has like zero pop culture references, had no idea who Sigourney Weaver was, had never seen that movie. And for any of you who haven't seen Alien, it's kind of unclear who the main character is for a while. So my flatmate also had no idea about the kind of stomach ripping scene. So that was a very fun experience for me, kind of watching it with somebody who had no kind of cultural context for it. But, you know, there's so much kind of body horror as relating to like parasites, which can, I think a lot of people have very justified fears around kind of childbirth, pregnancy, parenthood, and I think it's something I think about a lot, and it can be something that's like both beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. And I think it's a very like natural thing, but it's also a very strange thing. And feeling like you are not alone, like you are never by yourself because there is something else inside you, is really fascinating to me. I just kind of wanted to scratch that itch a bit. So I didn't realize those were the things that I was working through until other people were like, "Are you okay?" So those are the ones, I think.
Well, I mean, speaking of childbirth and stuff like that, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago that I looked at my mum one day and I just went, "Oh, I used to live in you," and that really freaked me out, and I can't stop thinking about it. I'm taller than her now. It's just the weirdest thing, man. Yeah. As like in terms of media, like books or film and anything like that, what are the ones that make you feel kind of seen or safe or heard?
Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I feel like that's a movie that was made for me, and my friend Rita is here, and we watched it together for the first time, and it was just like queer Asians, immigrants with issues with our parents, just having like cathartic laughing and crying in the back row of the cinema. And you know, it's a sci-fi film. It's also a family drama. It's also kind of a romance. It's basically every genre that you could possibly want. Also maybe superheroes. So I kind of feel like that's a piece of media that I'm just like, if something could be made for me, that and Crimson Peak, I feel like are the two sides of my very strange personality. So if you want to know more about me, go and watch those films. Yeah.
That's really tough. So like there's certain books that aren't necessarily horror, and I know this book isn't perfect by any means and is problematic in a lot of ways, but A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara did actually resonate with me in certain parts of the representation that I felt I identified with. And for some reason I thought it would be fun to go and see a 4-hour Danish play of it. Oh, it was really good actually. They like pumped smells out, like so when they're in the kitchen there was bleach, and it was very gratuitous though in the way that it shouldn't have been. But anyway, so that is something that kind of resonated with me. Growing up, The Mummy, because as we all know, our bi awakenings is all from The Mummy. Again, not all of it is aged very well, but it's one that it's a comfort, mild horror for me. And then I like any book or film where it shows how tough it has been for women to be heard. And this is quite a trope in and of itself, where there's a woman going through something, experiencing something, and usually her husband just doesn't believe her or like disregards what she's going through. So anything like that, I often identify with because I feel the frustration, and then I get mad, and then I'm like, I chose to do this to myself. But I mean, things like Shirley Jackson does it quite well. And she also handles mental illness quite well as well. Like we have always lived in the castle. Our quiz name, by the way, is always we have always quizzed in the castle, which Kat came up with. So yeah, Shirley Jackson does it quite well. Stories like The Yellow Wallpaper, obviously Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I always get that the wrong way around. Not great, but that story. So things like that always kind of resonate with me. So anything that kind of brings queerness in to horror, which again is another great topic for horror and Gothic to explore. And anything that's got Brendan Fraser in it, I guess.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is just have a quick 10-minute break. If you haven't got the magazine or had a drink or had anything to eat, come through and
also the raffle.
Yeah, well, that's coming afterwards.
Oh,
Because then we're
never
going to
mind.
come. Then we're going to, what's it called? Reconvene here. You can get your raffle presents, and if there's time, you might do some readings if there's time. Yeah. So yeah, 10 minutes. Off you go, and I will see you through there. Thank you.
Thank you.